Good Erev Shabbos, everyone. Erev Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael, Parshas Shlach, and in Chutz La'aretz, the Parsha of Baaloscha. And like I've been trying to do every week to really say something that's shayach, something that's connected to both Parshas, there's a simple one this week. The end of last week's Parsha, or this week's Parsha in America, is the story of Miriam and the lashon hara. And then the beginning of this week's Parsha is the story of the spies. And Rashi himself asked the question, what's the juxtaposition between the two Parshas? Why is it that last week ends with the story of Miriam and the lashon hara of Miriam, and this week the story of the spies? And Rashi says because the spies saw what happened to Miriam, that Miriam spoke lashon hara about Moshe, and they were rov lo lakhu musar. They saw and they didn't learn a proper lesson from it, because they didn't get the message of it. The message is that you can't speak lashon hara about things, and lashon hara is a dangerous thing. You get punished for it. Okay, shkoyach. How are they supposed to figure that out? Miriam spoke about a person. They're speaking about a land. So what's the similarity in crime? There's not even anything connected between the two. One is a simple act of lashon hara about a person. This is talking about the land. It's much more subtle. How are they supposed to get the message of the one and interpret it to the other? That's one problem. Another problem is that it's a little bit not understandable. Shlach lecha anoshim, that God said to send, that God said to Moshe. So there was a whole conversation, it was recorded in Rashi, that it's a conversation between God and Moshe as to whether they should send spies, not send spies. God says, look, as far as I'm concerned, I don't need spies. People feel that they're a little nervous, they need spies, so send spies. And then the whole thing turned out bad, and God knew it was going to turn out bad. There were so many indications that this thing was doomed from the very beginning. And if that's the case, why did God let them go through this exercise? Why didn't God just say, Moshe, trust me? No. Just tell them no. They'll be upset for a couple of days. They'll get over it. No. Instead, he says to Moshe, look, he gives him like this Jewish thing. As far as I'm concerned, you shouldn't send it. But if you want to send it, then go right ahead. You can send. Why put him through the whole exercise? And then it turns out terrible. And it turns out so terrible that, that night becomes the night they come back becomes a night of tragedy and travesty in the history of the Jewish people. Why was it necessary to go down that road? So I think the whole thing centers around maybe an idea that's brought out from a story in the Talmud. Talmud says in Gittin, Mem Hey Amid Aleph 45a, a very famous story. There was once a fellow by the name of Rabbi, by the name of Rav Ilish, who was taken captive. And he was, in his captivity, he had a cellmate. And the cellmate understood the language of the birds. There was a raven that came by and chirped. Rav Ilish said, what do you say? So the fellow looks at Rav Ilish and says, Ilish brach, Ilish brach. Says, Ilish run away, Ilish run away. So Rav Ilish said, you can't trust ravens. So he ignored it. A little while later, a dove came and started to chirp. He turns to the fellow and he said, what did the bird say? So the fellow says, Ilish brach, Ilish brach. Says, Ilish, get out of here, run away. Rav Ilish said, yeah, doves are trustworthy. Jewish people compared to doves. Okay, I'm going to follow it. And he ran away, saved himself. So, of course, the kasha of the Gemara is that what was going on? Why did Rav Ilish need to why did he trust this guy? He wouldn't trust a raven, because a raven is a bad bird, lying bird, whatever. So, a non-Jew, an idolater, you got to worry about him also. He's bad as a raven. So why do you trust him? He didn't trust him the first time, he trusted him the second time. So Akiva Eger and other Mefarshim say that the truth is that Rav Ilish understood the language of the birds also. He also knew exactly what the bird was saying. Rav Ilish didn't have a problem with trusting the birds. Rav Ilish had a problem with trusting himself. That he was worried that he wanted to hear that he should escape, and therefore every message that he heard was going to be about escaping. And that there was going to be, the bird didn't even have to be saying that, but that's what he was going to hear. Turns to the fellow and he says to him, What did the bird say? He wanted to know if this guy heard it also. But he was still worried that maybe it was his own interpretation. Maybe it was his own desire, and therefore the situation didn't, because it was coming from a raven. So he waited until it was coming from a dove. But the reason why he asked the other fellow is because Rav Elish did not trust the birds. He did not trust the other fellow and waited till he heard it from two different birds. Rav Elish wanted to make sure that what he was hearing was reality, because he knew he had an agenda. He knew that he had a desire. He wanted to get out of there. And therefore, he was afraid that that agenda that he had was going to color everything that he heard, because Rav Elish was a smart person. Rav Elish understood that we hear what we want to hear. We see what we want to see. If this is the way we want it to be, this is the way it's going to be. That was the problem of the Meraglim. That was the problem of the spies. God gave the spies an ability to be able to go, even though he knew that it was going to turn out bad, because this was now on the eve of going into the land of Israel. There was some important lesson that needed to be taught, and the lesson that needed to be taught is that you have choices. You have choices, and sometimes your choices are good, sometimes your choices turn out to be bad, but you have to learn how to make choices. And watch what happens when you make a bad choice. You send spies, you shouldn't send the spies, the whole thing unravels. Okay, but that's what happens in life. In life, sometimes you make wrong choices. And you learn from those wrong choices. You learn from the ability to make choices. If I take that away from you, a parent takes that away from a child, the ability to make a choice and the ability to make a wrong choice, thinking that they're protecting a child. They're not protecting a child. They're ruining a child. Because a child has to learn that you make choices and there are ramifications. Then you got to protect the child from hurting themselves. But at the end of the day, you got to let them make choices. You got to teach them how to make choices, because that's what life is all about. But you also have to teach them the tool of making a choice is make sure you're objective. Make sure you're really thinking it through. And sometimes you have to go and consult with other people. Sometimes you have to ask the guy next to you, what did you hear? What do you think this is? Sometimes you got to consult. You got to outsource. Because sometimes the truth lies outside of you because you are bent on something. Because your eyes are already seeing something. And you're not being objective. And that's what the sin of the spies was. The sin of the spies is that they lost all objectivity. Is that they had a bent. We can't do this. This is too difficult for us. And therefore they saw everything confirm that lesson. Miriam had a certain bent, a certain impression, a certain understanding of what reality was, of what her brother was, of what prophecy was, of what her place in Klal Yisrael was, what her other brother's place in Klal Yisrael was. She had a certain bent. She had a certain agenda. And when she saw something that happened with Moshe and his wife, she interpreted it a certain way. But she interpreted it that way because of her preconceived notions, because of the way that she had in her mind, she had structured things. And therefore, of course, it fell into that system and into that interpretation. The Meraglim Row, they saw exactly what happened to Miriam. They saw what happens when you're stuck on preconceived notions. V'lo lokhu musar. They didn't learn a lesson from there. It wasn't about lashon hara per se. It was about being stuck in your perceptions. And they did exactly the same thing. They wanted it to be a land that eats its inhabitants, so a land that eats its inhabitants. They wanted to say that they were seen like grasshoppers because they felt like grasshoppers. They were grasshoppers. Because it's all about preconceived notions to make decisions in life, which is critical. You have to shed those preconceived notions. You have to learn objectivity. You have to consult to make sure that you're being objective. Look, we have to do this a lot of times. Somebody asked me a shaila that had to do with me also. And I felt a certain way about it, but I couldn't comfortably say that this was what the halacha should be, because I'm no gay b'dover, because I've got a certain way that I wanted to see. So I consulted with another Rav, and I was right. But I had to be able to step outside of myself because I was stuck in the way I saw things. Yes, we have to trust our own intuition. Yes, we have to trust ourselves. But at the end of the day, we also have to understand that we see what we want to see and we hear what we want to hear. And therefore, we have to make sure that we're being objective. We have to make sure that we're not letting our own bent on things take us over. And that's one of the lessons of the spies. And that's one of the lessons of the story of Miriam. And that's why the two of them are together. So whether you're holding in America, or whether you're holding in Eretz Yisrael, whether it's Parshas Ba'aloscha, or whether it's Parshas Shlach, the message is the same. You have choices. But be careful when you make those choices that you're in fact being objective. You're not just seeing what you want to see and hearing what you want to hear, but you're seeing the emes. You're seeing the truth. Everybody should have a beautiful, awesome, amazing, wonderful Shabbos.